No heat, no supermarkets, and definitely no rescue helicopters. Medieval families faced winters so harsh that every year was a gamble between survival and disaster. When the fields froze and the pantries ran dry, they didn't have the option to call for help or run to the store. Instead, they relied on skills passed down through generations, real tricks that made the difference between making it to spring or not. In the next 15 seconds, you'll see every medieval hack that made starvation optional, starting with eating tree bark and ending with outsmarting pitch-black nights. If you think your camping hacks are clever, these old-school moves will put them to shame. Stick around, because each one could be the reason someone made it through another brutal winter. So, what did they actually eat when there was nothing left? When the usual food ran out, medieval peasants turned to one of the most unlikely solutions you can imagine: bark bread. Not a trendy health food, and definitely not something you'd find in a bakery. This was pure survival, turning the inner bark of trees into emergency calories that could keep you alive through another week of cold and hunger. It sounds absurd, but for people who had nothing else, the forest itself was the last pantry. Bark bread wasn't just a random experiment. It was a well-practiced, last-resort recipe that families passed down because it worked. The trick was knowing exactly which part of the tree to use and which species to trust. Medieval sources describe birch and pine cambium as staple famine foods, noting that birch produced sweeter flour than pine, while oak required extra preparation to remove toxic compounds. Monasteries kept detailed records about which trees were safest and most useful, because a single mistake could cost you more than a bad meal. The process started in early spring, when the sap was running, and the cambium, the thin, cream-colored layer, just beneath the tough outer bark, was at its softest and most nutritious. You couldn't just hack away at a tree and hope for the best. People learned to cut narrow, vertical strips, leaving enough bark for the tree to survive. If you stripped the whole way around, the tree died and you lost a future food source. This wasn't just about getting through one winter. It was early resource management, making sure you didn't destroy the only thing keeping you alive. Harvesting cambium took patience. You'd score lines down the trunk, careful not to go too deep, and peel off strips just wide enough to work with. Birch, pine, spruce, and elm were the main choices, but you had to know your trees. Some, like yew and laburnum, were completely off limits. One bite could be your last. Others, like oak, needed special treatment to remove bitter or toxic elements. It was a delicate balance. Go for a tree that's too young, and the sap could be poisonous. Too old, and the bark was leathery and useless. This was the kind of knowledge you picked up fast, or you didn't pick up anything at all. Once you had your strips of cambium, the next step was drying. No ovens, no fancy equipment, just warm stones by the hearth, or, if you were lucky, a low fire. The dried bark was tough, but that's where querns came in. Grinding the bark on a hearthstone, or with a simple hand quern turned it into a coarse, gritty flour. This wasn't anything like the fluffy flour you'd buy today. It was rough and fibrous, but it could be stretched with whatever grain you had left, or even mashed roots if you were really desperate. Mixing the bark flour with grain made it just edible enough to get down. The bread that came out of this process was dense, bitter, and gritty. Chewing it was work, and you'd sometimes get splinters between your teeth if you didn't grind it fine enough. But in places like Finland and Sweden, especially during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, this bread was all that stood between people and starvation. Some regions even developed their own versions, like the Sami people in Scandinavia, who relied on pine cambium as a staple and could go through 100 trees or more in a year. The nutritional value was surprisingly important. Cambium contains carbohydrates and vitamin C, which helped balance out the heavy diet of meat, fish, and milk in the far north. Scurvy was a real threat during long winters, but people who ate bark bread often managed to avoid it. Monasteries noted that birch cambium, in particular, made a sweeter, more palatable bread, while pine was more common but much harsher. Oak bark, if used at all, had to be soaked and treated to get rid of its bitterness and toxins. Making bark bread wasn't just about filling your stomach. It was a test of everything you knew about your environment. You had to identify the right tree at the right time, and take only what you needed, so the tree would keep growing. The scars left by centuries of bark harvesting can still be seen in old forests. Vertical strips taken from pines and birches, always leaving enough for the tree to survive. It was a kind of practical conservation, born out of necessity. Modern attempts to recreate bark bread, like the pechaleipa sold in Finland, show just how tough and unappealing this food really was. Even today, bakers describe the taste as eating rye bread before biting off a mouthful of pine bark. It's not something you'd eat by choice, but for medieval peasants, it was a lifeline. And the real secret? Most people today wouldn't even know where to start. Identifying a safe tree, harvesting the cambium, grinding it fine, and mixing it just right. It's a skill set that's almost disappeared. So next time you walk through a pine forest or see a birch tree, remember, that's not just scenery. For centuries, it was the difference between making it to spring or not. And while most modern survival guides skip right over this trick, it's proof that the old ways sometimes had the best answers, especially when there was nothing left to eat. Of course, food wasn't the only thing you needed to get through a brutal winter. Even if you had something to eat, you still had to figure out how to tie up bundles of firewood, fix a broken sled, or build a shelter without a single piece of store-bought rope. If you think food was the only thing medieval people had to worry about, think again. Rope wasn't a luxury. It was as basic as bread. You needed it for everything. Securing a load, fixing a broken sled, building a shelter, or just keeping your livestock from wandering off. And before you ask, no, you couldn't buy a spool at the store. Every inch of cordage came from the landscape, and making it was as important as knowing how to cook or keep a fire going. Let's start with nettles. Most people today see a patch of stinging nettles and walk the other way. Medieval peasants saw a supply of the strongest natural rope around. Medieval records describe sewing nettle fibers into ropes that could outperform modern hemp. The trick was to wait until late summer, when the stalks reached peak strength. You'd cut the stems low, bundle them, and then let them soak in a stream for a few weeks, a process called retting. This rotted away the soft stuff, leaving behind the tough inner fibers. It was messy and smelled awful, but it worked. Once ret, the stalks were stripped down, exposing pale, glossy ribbons. Here's where technique mattered. Medieval rope makers didn't just spin fibers together at random. They rolled the fibers on their thighs to align them, then counter-twisted bundles together, one way for the individual strands, and the opposite way for the whole rope. This made the rope tighten under stress, turning a handful of weeds into cord strong enough to haul a bucket from a well or lash together a roof. The Sami in Scandinavia wove 50-foot lengths of nettle rope using this thigh-rolling twist technique, and their rope rivaled anything you'd get from industrial hemp. Nettle rope was the star, but willow bark was another heavy hitter. In early spring, when the sap started to rise, you'd look for young willow shoots. With a sharp knife, you'd score spiral cuts around the stems, then peel off the inner bark in long, flexible strips. While the bark was still green, you'd twist it tightly into cords. As it dried, the fibers shrank and hardened, locking everything together. Willow bark rope was prized for its flexibility and longevity, perfect for lashings, baskets, and anything that needed to bend without snapping. Other plants had their own roles. Basswood bark was stripped in long sheets and split into ribbons. Flax needed to be carefully separated into individual fibers before twisting. Wild hemp required crushing and combing to get rid of the woody bits. Each plant had its own season and its own method, and knowing the difference could mean the success or failure of your next project. Medieval rope makers could judge the quality of a fiber by touch alone, knowing exactly how much twist each type needed for maximum strength. Sometimes, survival meant getting creative. Siege chronicles note hair braided into ropes to haul supplies over castle walls when every other material ran out. It wasn't common, but it shows just how far people would go to get the job done. Desperation turned anything into cordage if you had the patience and the need. The real magic of medieval rope wasn't just in the materials, it was in the method. The counter-twisting technique made rope far stronger than the sum of its parts. Modern bushcrafters who try it today are often surprised by how strong a handful of nettle or willow bark can become if twisted right. Archaeological finds have turned up medieval ropes still holding together after centuries underground. These weren't party tricks, they were the backbone of daily life. You couldn't afford to waste anything. Every scrap of fiber was put to use. Broken ropes were retwisted, shorter pieces were spliced together, and nothing was thrown away unless it was truly useless. Rope making wasn't just about having something to tie with. It was a survival skill, and everyone in the community knew at least the basics. The knowledge was passed down, refined, and tested every single year. If you want to see how tough you really are, try making rope from scratch. Most people can't even identify nettle or willow, let alone process it into cordage. But that was the challenge. Pick the right plant, harvest it at the right time, process the fibers, and twist them until you have something strong enough to trust with real weight. The Sami could make ropes long enough to lash together sleds or tie up reindeer using nothing but thigh-rolled nettle. That's not just a neat trick. It's proof that necessity breeds real skill. Today, rope comes in neat plastic packages, and most people never think about what it takes to make it. But in medieval times, your ability to create cordage from weeds and bark could mean the difference between making it through the winter or not. The next time you see a patch of nettles or a willow tree by a stream, remember, that was the medieval version of a hardware store, and everyone knew how to shop. Of course, rope alone wouldn't keep you alive. Even if you had the best cordage in the world, you still had to figure out what to eat when the fields were empty and the pantry was bare. That's where real survival started, knowing how to spot a meal where most people saw nothing at all. When your pantry is empty and the fields are nothing but mud and frost, dinner isn't coming from a store or even your own garden. For medieval peasants, foraging wasn't a hobby. It was a basic skill for staying alive. You couldn't afford to be picky. Every patch of weeds, every stretch of riverbank, every clump of trees became a potential meal if you knew where to look and what to grab. This wasn't just a matter of grabbing whatever looked green. Medieval foragers had knowledge that would put most modern survivalists to shame. They could walk out the door and come back with a basket full of wild greens, roots, and maybe a few fish, all without a shopping list. Forget fancy recipes. The real challenge was knowing which plants would fill your stomach and which ones would send you to the village healer if you made it that far. Take spring, for example. The snow melts, and everything starts to grow again. Medieval peasants knew exactly when to look for nettle shoots, packed with vitamins and easy to cook down into something that passed for spinach. Wild garlic was another favorite, popping up in shady spots and adding a punch of flavor to whatever else you'd scraped together. Even dandelions weren't just weeds, they were dinner. The roots, leaves, and flowers all ended up in the cooking pot, sometimes boiled, sometimes eaten raw if you were desperate. And this wasn't guesswork. Every family handed down tricks for telling safe plants from dangerous ones, like how the fuzz on a leaf or the snap of a root could mean the difference between a meal and a mistake you'd never repeat. But foraging wasn't just about greens. Peasants needed calories, and that meant roots, nuts, and anything with a bit of fat. Burdock root, pulled from the edge of fields, was starchy enough to fill you up. Acorns, the nuts most people today would ignore, became a staple in bad years. Fresh from the tree, they're so bitter you'd spit them out, but medieval cooks knew to grind them into meal and soak them over and over, dumping out the tannin-stained water until the taste was gone. After that, you could bake the meal into flatbread or stir it into pottage. Pottage, by the way, was the medieval version of mystery stew. Every household had a pot simmering over the fire, sometimes for days at a time. Whatever you found, roots, greens, scraps of fish or meat, went in. It was watery, bland, and sometimes hid more than just vegetables. Weevils, grit, and whatever else made it into the pot got boiled right along with everything else. The goal wasn't flavor, it was survival. The longer the pot cooked, the more you could stretch what little you had. Streams and rivers were another lifeline. Medieval fishing didn't require fancy gear. Hooks were carved from animal bones or whittled from tough wood. Thorns made decent substitutes if you were careful. Fish traps were a real game changer. Woven from willow branches and set in the shallows, they could catch enough fish overnight to feed a family or two. Archaeological digs have turned up these bone hooks and bits of woven fish traps, proof that this wasn't just a story. It was daily life. Sometimes entire villages worked together to build weirs, underwater fences that guided fish into holding pens, making it possible to collect dozens of fish without standing in the cold for hours. Of course, not everything you pulled from the wild was safe. The wrong berry or mushroom could end things fast. Medieval foragers relied on strict rules. If you didn't know the plant by sight, smell, and season, you left it alone. Oral traditions, songs, rhymes, and warnings helped kids remember which berries to eat and which ones to avoid. Mistakes happened, but the cost was high enough that most people learned fast. Making wild food edible was a whole other skill set. You couldn't just chew on whatever you found. Acorns needed repeated soaking. Some roots had to be boiled for hours to get rid of toxins. Even edible plants could taste awful unless you knew how to cook them. Medieval cooks used vinegar brines to preserve fish and meat, especially during famine years. Jars of salted or pickled fish could last a whole season, and the brine kept out bacteria when you didn't have refrigeration. Cooking pits heated and sealed with peat, baked bark, and roots underground, a trick that softened tough fibers and made starchy foods less bitter. On screen, you'd see a quick note: medieval cooking pits heated and sealed with peat for baking bark and roots. Protein was always in short supply, so nothing went to waste. If you caught more fish than you could eat, you dried them over a smoky fire or salted them down in barrels. Meat, when you had it, got the same treatment. The goal was to stretch every calorie as far as possible, because you never knew when the next meal would come. The real magic of medieval foraging wasn't just in finding food, but in knowing what to do with it. You could spot a patch of wild sorrel and know that it would keep you from getting scurvy. You'd find hazelnuts and squirrel them away for winter, knowing they were packed with fat and protein. Every season brought new options, and missing the right window could mean going hungry later. This encyclopedic knowledge wasn't written down for most people. It was passed from parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, in stories and lessons learned the hard way. Modern survival shows make foraging look dramatic, but most of us would struggle to name 5 wild edibles, let alone prepare them safely. Medieval peasants didn't have that luxury. Their survival depended on remembering which shoots came up in April, which nuts were ready in October, and how to make the bitterest root edible with enough work. If you want to try it for yourself, take a walk and see if you can spot even one wild plant you could eat, then look up how it's actually prepared. Most people are surprised by how much food is hiding in plain sight, but also by how much work goes into making it safe and edible. Of course, all the foraged food in the world doesn't help if you don't have the right tools to harvest, process, and cook it. And medieval peasants didn't have a drawer full of gadgets. They had to make everything from scratch, using nothing but what they found in the landscape. Let's talk about tools for a second. If you think your multi-tool is impressive, you should see what medieval peasants managed with a creek bed full of rocks and a pile of animal bones. They didn't just make do, they built everything they needed from scratch, turning the rawest materials into sharp blades, sturdy containers, and gear that could last for years. It wasn't about showing off or passing time. If you couldn't make a tool, you risked going hungry, freezing, or just getting stuck with nothing to cook in. The real magic started with flint knapping. Forget the idea that stone tools are just for cave people. For centuries, shaping flint or obsidian into blades was as normal as chopping wood. First, you had to find the right stone. No GPS, no internet, just a sharp eye for the right glint in a riverbank or cliff. Once you had a chunk, you had to read the rock. You'd look for natural fracture lines and hidden cracks, knowing that one wrong hit would shatter the whole thing. The process was called controlled fracturing, which is a polite way of saying you had to strike the stone at exactly the right angle again and again until thin, razor-sharp flakes popped off. This wasn't luck. It took years to get right, but the payoff was a blade sharper than most modern knives, sometimes even sharper than surgical steel. Archaeologists have tested these flint blades and found they can outcut stainless steel, making them deadly effective for everything from slicing meat to carving wood. Bones were the next big resource. After a meal, nothing went to waste. Medieval craftsmen turned animal remains into specialized tools, using every part for a different job. Large cow or deer bones became awls and scrapers. Hollow bird bones were perfect for needles. The trick was knowing which bone worked for which tool. A bird's leg bone, light and hollow, made sewing needles for repairing clothing or tents. Deer antler, dense and tough, was carved into handles or scrapers for cleaning hides and smoothing wood. This wasn't just busy work. It was the difference between having a warm coat or going cold, between being able to fix a roof or letting the rain in. The skill was in the details. Pick the wrong bone, and your tool snapped the first time you put it to work. But making a sharp edge or a strong point was only half the job. You had to attach it to something useful. Medieval toolmakers had a system for this, and it worked better than you'd think. They'd split a wooden handle, slide in the stone or bone blade, and then bind it all together using sinew, plant fibers, or strips of animal hide. Sinew, pulled from tendons, was soaked for flexibility, then wrapped around the joint. As it dried, it shrank, locking everything in place with a grip so tight you could chop wood or slice through thick hide without the blade budging. Plant fibers, twisted and braided, worked almost as well. These bindings weren't just strong. They lasted for years, surviving cold, wet, and constant use. Containers were another essential. You had to carry water, store food, and cook meals, all without modern pots or bottles. Medieval craftsmen harvested birch bark in spring, peeling off single sheets large enough to fold into waterproof containers. They'd crease the bark, punch holes, and stitch the seams with roots, no glue needed. The result was a bucket or box that didn't leak, perfect for hauling water or storing grain. For tougher jobs, they dug clay from riverbanks, shaped it by hand, and fired it in simple pits. No pottery wheels, no modern kilns, just a good eye for the right clay and a careful fire. These pots held up through winter freezes and daily use, keeping food safe from pests and rot. You didn't see endless tool options. Every item had to earn its keep. A flint blade wasn't just a knife. It became a scraper, a chisel, or even a makeshift axe if you lashed it to a stick. Bone needles stitched clothing, but also fixed baskets and shoes. Hooks and fishing lines came from sharpened bones and leftover sinew. If you needed more storage, you wove baskets from tough grasses or willow twigs, strong enough to haul firewood or potatoes. Some families even made fish nets from twisted nettle fibers, using the same plants that gave them rope. People got creative when materials ran short. Accounts note that Flatlanders braided hair into ropes when no cordage was available, using every possible resource to get the job done. Nothing was wasted. If a tool broke, you salvaged what you could, reshaped the blade, or used the fragments for something new. Even the smallest flint flakes became arrowheads or tiny scrapers for cleaning hides. The real challenge wasn't just making a tool, it was making one that worked well enough to trust with your survival. Most of us today would struggle to make a sharp edge, let alone a container that holds water or a needle that can sew leather. Medieval peasants could do it all, often with nothing more than what they found on a walk through the woods or a quick search after dinner. If you want to know how tough these tools really were, consider this. Archaeologists have found flint blades, bone awls, and bark containers that survived centuries underground. The design wasn't flashy, but it worked. You could hand one of these knives to someone today, and they'd have a hard time telling if it came from a modern craftsman or a medieval hut. These weren't just relics. They were proof that necessity pushed people to develop skills and solutions that still hold up. So next time you reach for a kitchen knife or a water bottle, remember that medieval peasants built their own versions from the ground up, using nothing but rocks, bones, and a little ingenuity. Every tool was made to last, and every mistake was a lesson learned the hard way. But having a sharp blade or a sturdy pot was only part of the equation. Staying alive in a medieval winter meant keeping warm and dry, even when the weather turned brutal and the nights dragged on. Tools helped, but survival depended on something even more basic: finding heat, shelter, and a way to outlast the cold. Staying alive through a medieval winter wasn't about brute force or luck. It was about knowing how to keep warm when the wind cut through your walls and the snow piled up for months. Heat and shelter weren't just comforts, they were survival, and medieval people had answers that still put modern gear to shame. First problem: fire. When you're staring down sleet, rain, or a week of damp air, most modern fire starters give up fast. Medieval peasants used fatwood, the resin-packed heartwood from old pine branches, because it burned hot even when soaked. They didn't just toss on a log and hope for the best. They scraped fatwood into hair-thin shavings for tinder, then layered on thicker curls, building a fire that could take a single spark and turn it into a lifesaver. Birch bark was the backup plan. It peeled off in sheets, thin as paper and loaded with oils, and caught fire from the smallest spark, even in the middle of a downpour. People didn't just know these tricks, they relied on them, night after night, because a missed fire could mean a night of freezing or worse. But a fire only helps if you've got a place to keep the heat in. Forget tents and sleeping bags. Medieval survivors dug into the earth itself. They built shelters below the frost line, using hillsides or pits to trap warmth and block the wind. These earth shelters didn't just keep you from freezing, they could stay comfortable even during blizzards, all without a single piece of modern insulation. Building one took real skill. You had to read the ground, figure out which soil would drain and which would flood, and dig deep enough to get below the worst of the cold. If you messed up, you'd end up sleeping in a puddle. But if you got it right, you could outlast storms that would send most campers running for a hotel. Inside, insulation was everything. Medieval people layered materials in a way that put most modern sleeping systems to shame. Closest to the skin came animal fur, sheepskin, rabbit, whatever you could get your hands on. Over that, they stuffed dried grass or reeds between the walls and under sleeping benches. Dried grass trapped air, creating a barrier that kept the cold out and the warmth in. On the outside, they tied together mats woven from plant fibers. These mats shed water but let moisture escape, so you didn't end up sleeping in your own sweat. This system worked so well that some earth shelters stayed warm and dry even after centuries underground. It wasn't flashy, but it worked, and it kept families alive through the worst winters. Clothing was another line of defense. Everything was made by hand, using materials that were both waterproof and breathable. Animal hides were turned into coats and boots using salt, smoke, and careful processing. Sheep provided thick, insulating wool. Deer and elk hides gave you mobility and weather resistance. Up north, seal skin kept out freezing rain. The secret was in how the hides were treated: scraped, soaked, stretched, and softened until they could shrug off water but still let your body breathe. Modern outdoor brands try to copy this with technical fabrics, but medieval layering could outperform most of what you'll find in stores when it came to constant snowdrifts and days of wet cold. Medieval people also had a talent for predicting the weather. No radar, no apps. They watched clouds, tracked wind shifts, and paid attention to animal behavior. When cattle moved towards shelter or birds disappeared, it was time to reinforce your roof and add extra insulation. This wasn't guesswork, it was a survival skill, passed down through generations, and it often gave them more warning than today's forecasts. The effectiveness of these earth shelters still surprises archaeologists. Layers of packed dirt and scorched stone show that families stayed warm and dry, even while snow piled up outside. These shelters also doubled as protection from raids and wild animals, hiding people away when danger came knocking. The methods were simple, but the results were hard to beat. It's not just about nostalgia. Modern gear borrows a lot from these old tricks. Multi-layered clothing, insulated sleeping systems, and waterproof shelters all have roots in what medieval people figured out with nothing but fur, grass, and plant fibers. Yet, with all our technology, most people would struggle to last a week in those conditions. The old techniques worked because they were simple, reliable, and used what was available. So, next time you see a fancy tent or a high-tech jacket, remember that medieval survivors did more with less. Their lives depended on knowing how to build warmth from the ground up, layer by layer, night after night. They didn't have the option to run to the store or flip a switch. They made it through because they knew how to use every resource around them. Of course, warmth and shelter were just the start. Medieval people looked at every scrap and leftover as a potential asset, even the stuff most of us would toss out without a second thought. And sometimes, the real secret to survival was hiding right in the ashes at the bottom of the hearth. Most people today sweep out their fireplace, dump the ashes, and never give it a second thought. In the medieval world, that would be like throwing away a toolbox, a medicine kit, and a cleaning supply all at once. Ash wasn't just a leftover mess. It was a resource that everyone from peasants to skilled craftsmen relied on for everyday survival. If you knew what you were doing, ash could clean, preserve, heal, and even keep your teeth from falling out. Here's the thing. Not all ash was created equal. Medieval people didn't just scoop up whatever was left in the hearth and hope for the best. The type of wood you burned mattered, and knowing the difference was real expertise. Oak ash was the heavy hitter. Its high potassium content, specifically potassium oxide, or K2O, made it perfect for making strong lye. That's the stuff you need to turn animal fat into soap that actually works. But oak ash was so powerful, it could burn skin or ruin food if you weren't careful. It was the go-to when you had to tackle the worst grime or make soap that could actually cut through grease, but you wouldn't catch anyone tossing it into their dinner. Beech ash, on the other hand, was the gentle touch. It had more calcium and less potassium, which made it the choice for anything that needed a milder lye. Beech ash was used to clarify honey, neutralize the sourness in food, and create cleaning solutions that wouldn't strip your hands raw. You could use it in the kitchen, soaking beans, calming down acidic stews, or giving honey a clear finish. The difference wasn't just a matter of taste. It was the line between a meal that kept you going and a disaster that left you sick. Some ashes were even more specialized. Take vine ash, for example. In some places, the ash from grapevines was so valuable for dental care that it was occasionally traded at rates higher than salt. The minerals in vine ash made it perfect for tooth cleaning pastes that actually helped prevent decay, a rare win in a time when most people lost their teeth young. People would burn grape prunings down to a fine, pale ash, mix it into a gritty paste, and use it to scrub their teeth. Forget modern toothpaste. This was the medieval answer to keeping your smile, and it worked well enough that people were willing to trade precious salt for a handful. Burning wood for ash wasn't just about tossing logs on a fire. Medieval ash makers paid close attention to how they built and tended their fires. The goal was a slow, complete burn that left nothing but white ash. No black charcoal, no half-burned pieces. The temperature, airflow, and even the way the wood was stacked all mattered. A sloppy fire gave you bitter, uneven ash that could be useless or even dangerous. The right fire, carefully managed, produced ash that was pure and ready for use in everything from soap to food to medicine. When it came time to use the ash, medieval people relied on traditional tests to make sure they got it right. For soap making, they'd mix the ash with water to make a lye solution, then float an egg in it to check the strength. If the egg floated just right, neither sinking nor popping up too high, they knew the lye was strong enough to turn fat into soap, but not so strong it would burn skin. The process wasn't exact science, but it worked. Soap makers combined the lye with animal fats in careful proportions, stirring and heating the mix until it thickened. Too much lye, and the soap was caustic. Too little, and it stayed greasy. They judged the finished soap by touch and color. Slick, but not slimy, solid, but not chalky. Ash found its way into food, too, but only with the right kind. Beech ash, with its mild lye, was used to soak and soften beans, clarify honey, and even preserve some foods. It could neutralize acids and extend the shelf life of things that would otherwise spoil fast. People learned to sprinkle a little ash into sour stews, or over wild greens to make them more palatable. In some cases, ash was even used to treat wounds or soothe skin irritations, though always with care, since the wrong type could do more harm than good. Preserving food was another big win for ash. Smoked meats and salted fish sometimes got a final dusting of fine ash before storage. The alkaline minerals helped keep bugs away and slowed down spoilage, making it possible to stretch precious food through the leanest months. Ash from the right wood, used by someone who knew what they were doing, could mean the difference between eating in spring or going hungry. You'd see all sorts of uses: soap bubbling in a pot over the fire, a slab of meat getting a careful sprinkle of ash, a bowl of gritty paste ready for brushing teeth, and jars of honey, clearing as beach ash settled to the bottom. These weren't just clever tricks, they were everyday routines, passed down because they worked. Most people today would miss out on all of this, tossing ash without a second glance, never realizing what they're losing. In the end, medieval ash wasn't a miracle, but it was a toolkit that let people solve problems with nothing but what was left in the hearth. It was knowledge that separated those who made it through the winter from those who didn't. Every handful of ash was a reminder that survival was about more than just luck. It was about knowing how to use every scrap, every leftover, and every forgotten byproduct. And when you look at all these tricks, turning bark into bread, weeds into rope, wild greens into dinner, and even ashes into soap and medicine, it's clear that medieval survival wasn't about brute strength or endless supplies. It was about grit, sharp eyes, and the kind of everyday wisdom that most of us have forgotten. Medieval survival wasn't about luck or brute force. It was about using every resource and knowing exactly what to do with it. Eating tree bark, weaving nettle rope, and making ash-based soap weren't just backup plans. They were daily routines. The most skilled foragers could sustain themselves year-round in woodlands that would challenge today's experts, thanks to knowledge passed down over generations. Hunting relied on bone hooks and woven branch weirs to catch fish overnight, while root foraging demanded precise timing to avoid toxins. If you're even a little curious, try one of these old tricks yourself. Subscribe and let me know, which medieval hack would you actually risk first?